Imagine a world in which people are unaware of changing climate. In fact, awareness of the environment is mostly through changes in how we're using land or whether there's more snow or rain than there was last year. There is no New York Times environment page. This scenario describes the US in the 1950s when Margaret Davis first took an undergraduate class on paleobotany, or the study of plant species that were growing in past environments. And she found her scientific passion. Margaret Davis's work taught us about the constant, if slow, change in the distribution of trees in North America, and also about how to use that information from pollen to reconstruct past climate. We know that glaciers move with changing climate, and trees can't colonize or grow where there's ice. As the climate warms, either historically or in the present, plants and animals colonize that newly ice-free area. And each year, these plants leave a record of having been present in a location. Here's how they do it. Plants make pollen, and some of that pollen falls onto lakes, it sinks, and it's trapped in the mud. As decades and centuries pass, lakes get layers of pollen in the mud that tells a story of which species were present and how abundant they were. Now, picture yourself driving on the shores of Lake Superior. Maybe a few weeks ago, you went up there to see the fall colors and took a picture like this. There's a mixture of many different tree species, but about 20,000 years ago, this entire area was covered in a thick layer of glacial ice. And about 10,000 years ago, as that ice receded, trees started to arrive through time following that glacial retreat. So clearly, all of these species must have arrived since the last glacier was there. But how do we predict which species will arrive and follow the glaciers as they recede? So answering this question is really important for understanding how all kinds of communities assemble. How do species come together in a location? Plants, animals, even diseases. Do communities shift as whole units? That was a prevailing thought at the time, that all of the species showed up together. But it's possible that species arrived individually, right? They were following different trajectories, and so the species that were present in one location at one time was just a snapshot of species moving through. Margaret Davis wanted to understand more about how this happened. In the 1950s and 60s, these questions were of great interest to ecologists, but primarily with respect to past climate, as glaciers expanded and retreated. Although a few scientists knew that the humans might be able to change Earth's climate, I'll let that sink in for a minute, this was not pervasive, and these two intellectual realms had not yet been strongly coupled. Margaret Davis, through her pollen work in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, at Yale, Harvard, Michigan, and finally at the University of Minnesota, played a critical role in early studies investigating plant community change in response to changing climate. And she laid the groundwork for people around the world to know more about climate change. Every species makes pollen with its own distinct shape. Because of this, Margaret Davis was able to use fossilized pollen in sediment cores from lake bottoms to learn how plant communities changed over time. She made major contributions to methods as well, for instance, developing ways to use pollen production rates from live trees to get more accurate pictures of how plant communities change through time. She discovered when species arrive in a location, she discovered which species were present through time, how rapidly populations expanded in size, and how traits of different species affected their colonizing ability. So in this image, when you look at the very top, like the figure that Jim showed, that is the surface of the mud. And you follow it down through that slide to the bottom, and that is the base of the mud, the ancient mud that was laid down. And each of these lines represents a different tree species that is in that mud, the pollen from that tree species. You can see some species were very abundant in past environments, and some are abundant in current environments. And in some cases, there were dramatic shifts They're a very short period of time. By studying many lakes, she also discovered that plant communities shift rapidly, and they don't shift as whole units, but with individual species following different trajectories, going different directions at different rates. Her later work in the Upper Peninsula allowed her to learn how different species overcome large dispersal barriers. For some species, large barriers can be crossed, but it can take 1,000 years. For other species, they may have very small seeds, and those seeds can move rapidly over long distances by flying through the air. Species that were confusing were those with large seeds like an acorn that moved more rapidly than she expected from its seed size. So that leads me to a personal story of change that Margaret Davis made. As an undergraduate, I had read some of Margaret Davis's work, and I was entranced by the idea that tree species could migrate. So I wrote and asked her if she would hire me when I graduated. She actually responded, here's the letter, with a very supportive letter that led to job offers both at Cedar Creek and ultimately in Evel Gorham's lab. And she gave me hope and confidence in my abilities and launched me, in part, on a career in ecology. So she likely encouraged the careers of many, but for me, well, I still have that letter. The long-term consequences of Margaret Davis's work did not emerge completely until the scientific community and greater society began to realize the full extent of current climate change. Now in 2017, there's a consensus among scientists that climate is changing. Recent estimates suggest that climate zones are shifting north about 1/4 of a mile every year. Margaret Davis's work provides some hope that at least some plant species may be able to keep up with current rates of change. And there are many scientists that are building from the work of Margaret Davis and building on her legacy to better understand what future Earth may look like, some of whom were aspiring scientists who she encouraged along her way. So Margaret Davis is also in the audience. Margaret, could you also stand so we can acknowledge you?